Welcome everyone to episode 4 of Snippit Science Podcast. Today we're discussing the paper Effect of Swearing on Strength and Power Performance by Stephensa and Co. I'll be discussing it with Jared Coleman-Stark, and let's get straight into it. Jared, what's the paper about?
It's been previously observed that swearing decreases pain. So the researchers have had a great rationale here where exercise creates pain, and if swearing decreases pain, then you might be able to exercise more. Just expanding on that a little bit, there's a stimulus at the beginning, like anything else. So that stimulus is pain, for example. And then there's an emotional response to that pain, which would typically be frustration or a very low form of anger. And you respond to that emotion with behavior, swearing. When you swear, there's an increase in sympathetic nervous system activation, which we see as an increase in epinephrine or adrenaline, and in norepinephrine or noradrenaline. What the effects of those have is they increase heart rate, they increase blood pressure, and they also increase skin conductance. When those happen, we get an increased oxygenation to the muscles, as well as an analgesic effect, a pain lessening effect. And subsequently from those, we expect there to be a performance increase.
So that's why when I swear, when I hit my head, I feel better.
Yes, exactly.
Perfect. So in the study, what did they do?
So they took a large number of participants. They made an excellent power calculation based on the effect sizes from previous research, where previous research has found that swearing decreases pain at an effect size of about 0.6. So for them to be able to find an effect size of 0.6, they back calculated to determine how many participants they needed. Quick note on the gender, they did note that they weren't going to look at any gender differences, which I found a little bit peculiar because in their introduction, they actually note some gender differences in regards to swearing. So, for example, 9% of males and 4% of female responders deemed fuck to be a mild swear word or not a swear word at all. So we see that there's a difference in how men and women are responding to swear words. And also we know that women have a much higher pain tolerance. So I would expect if we've already seen differences in gender response to the intervention and in the outcomes, I think it would be a good thing to look at.
Yeah, definitely. Always a good point and very perceptive there. So they did 2 different procedures or experiments. What did they do?
So the first experiment was a Wingate. So that's just 30 seconds maximal sprinting on a bike. And the second experiment was a isometric hand grip task, where you hold on to what's called a dynamometer and you squeeze it as hard as you can. And a pretty straightforward test that we use pretty often. Just one note on the Wingate is that it was a running start. So they got the flywheel going and then they actually went into the measurements. So that might be a little different from how some people might do the Wingate. What they did with those is they took several measures, but overall very standard methodology, very standard instrumentation, pretty much nothing unusual, I would say, in that space.
And in terms of the words they chose, how they choose the swear word and how they choose the control.
Right, so that's very important. So the way they chose the swear word is they individualized it by asking the participants for a swear word that they would use in response to banging their head accidentally. Whereas for the neutral word, the non-swearing condition, they asked the participants for a word that they would use to describe a table. So one thing I would have liked to see as we move into the results, one of the first things I would have liked to see is what were the actual words?
Yeah, it would have been great.
Yeah, just a listing of out of 29 participants that made it through the study, this many used this word, this many used this word, just as a bit of a listing.
Yeah, exactly right. And so a nice, clean study by the looks of it. What did they find?
Yes, so the big findings were that in the Wingate, there was an increase in peak power, about 24 watts. Pretty significant.
Yeah.
An effect size of 0.6. Also an increase in average power for the Wingate, about 11 watts. And also an effect size of about 0.6. And there was also a increase in the Wingate power drop, which is a fatigue index measure where you take the peak power minus the lowest power. So that's something I would have sort of expected is primarily just from the increase in peak power, you're going to see more of a drop off. But then also because they've gone harder by having a greater peak power and greater average power, they're also going to be creating quite a bit more fatigue. And that effect size was about 0.4.
And in the handheld test?
Yep, so in the handheld test, we saw grip force increased in the swearing condition by an effect size of 0.7, which corresponded to an additional 2.1 kilograms of force. And we also saw an increase in the perceived exertion score by looks like a full 1.5 points there. So, which was an effect size of 0.66. And that's a bit counter to what we would have expected, is that there was an increase in that perceived exertion. We would have thought if someone's swearing, they'd feel a little bit less exerted. There'd be less pain. And that's sort of the opposite of what we saw, which I suppose is just on the back of they were working harder. Yes. And so they had a higher rating of perceived exertion.
One of the parts that the paper talks about is obviously the sympathetic nervous system activation.
Mm-hmm.
Any markers there that they looked at, and did they see any response that indicated that there was some form of activation?
So that was quite interesting that although we saw these performance effects, there was no increase in the sympathetic nervous system activation. So unusual, because that was the proposed mechanism at the beginning of the study, is it causes this increase in sympathetic activation, which would then result in an ultimate increase in performance. But we don't see that sympathetic activation despite the increase in performance. And also they found no reduction in pain. So none of the original proposed mechanisms for why are we going to see performance were shown. And so there must be other mechanisms that are at play there. Alternatively, the stimulus from the exercise might have just overshadowed those responses, because you go for a sprint or you're doing a maximal force test, you're going to have very high sympathetic activation. And how much does swearing do on top of that? Not all that much. So it could be working as a distraction. So simply you're doing the exercise, you distract the brain, you remove some of that central fatigue. Alternatively, one of the mechanisms given was about the plosiveness of the word. So essentially plosiveness, which is speech sound produced by complete closure of the oral passage and subsequent release accompanied by a burst of air, could result in a...
It's almost like a Valsalva when you lift it, like that
right.
Short bracing.
Right.
So when you're doing a maximal effort, you're
right.
able to brace harder, grip harder.
Right. And the other thing is when you're exhaling, so when you're speaking, you're exhaling. So when you're exhaling against pressure, so if you have pursed lips, like... or you have a closed glottis, so the back of your throat. So if you've got that a little bit closed off and you're exhaling against a pressure, it actually activates your vagus nerve as well. So that's a method that's used pretty commonly in meditation, is that when you exhale while you're doing meditative breathing, you apply a bit of pressure during the exhalation to be stimulating the vagus nerve. So there's a difference in how we're expiring air that will have an effect on what we're doing. So different words have different levels of plosiveness.
And that's where the point you made earlier about having the words in a table would have been really great to...
Right.
Just for the reader to understand what kind of words they were using and how that may affect. And we know in some of our other work that we've been doing about, we use testosterone as one of our markers. Does the swearing word have that aggressive nature, which may be indicated by increases in testosterone, whereas the words of a table, so when I think like a smooth table,
right.
like nice and it glistens,
right.
really nice, calming words, does that then not have that same effect on testosterone, for example?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Which we know that, it's related to strength, speed, power, exertion, effort, and determination. So, different marker may have actually shown something here.
Yeah, and I consider testosterone to be a very sympathetic stress hormone, essentially. It could be driving that. And I mean, when you're swearing, when you're saying a socially unacceptable word, you're expressing social dominance, which would be a massive trigger for a testosterone boost.
Exactly.
So you could easily be getting a bump in testosterone there.
So that's a really great overview of the study there, Jared. So just in conclusions, any thoughts or final words?
Yeah, so final take on this is, looks like a really great way to increase strength and power. The only question is, can you actually apply it in your gym?
Well, that's always the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it was a really good, clean study. It was actually quite fun to read. I think as a coach myself, I've read it and been able to see that I know it works. And you have a fun paper that I'm sure when the athletes get a hold of this, they'll be bringing up to all the coaches. And I see a coach, I can start swearing in the gym.
And I mean, honestly, it's really just a cultural constraint that we're putting on ourselves. So if it's culturally appropriate, I mean, say you're in a rugby club, you'll hear swearing.
Definitely.
Whereas in other facilities, you might not hear any swearing at all.
That's the place that we live in. So thank you for your time today, Jared.
Thank you.
Thank you, listeners, for listening into today's paper. For more information, remember to visit our website at snippetscience.com. And also remember to follow us on Twitter at Snippet Science. Tune in next week.